What is a translation if the original text turns out not to exist at all? Is such a text still a translation? And do we need a source text to be able to define a text as a translation? These are the questions that sparked my interest in the topic I am going to present today, pseudo-translations. In literary history, we do find a number of the so-called pseudo-translations. What is a pseudo-translation? What is a pseudo-translation? Several scholars tried to define it. For example, Popovich defined it as an original work published by its author as a fictitious translation, thereby making use of the reader's expectations. Turi referred to the differentiation between source literature, the literature one translates from, and target literature, the literature one translates into, and redefined pseudo-translations as target literature texts which are regarded in the target culture as translations, although no genuine source text exists for them. Yalom classified them as literary forgeries, together with pseudo-memoirs or pseudo-letters, and Lefebvre, in turn, spoke of reflection of texts, even if those texts turn out not to exist at all. Emily Apter defined them as translation with no original, or spoke also about literature hors de ce monde, no? So literature out of this world. So what characterizes pseudo-translation is the reference to a non-existing proto-text or to a group of non-existing proto-texts to which the alleged source text belongs. To create this reference, authors have several tools at their disposal. They can, for example, explicitly present a text as a translation, or they can provide it with various signals of translationism, with translational features such as, for example, lexical items and syntactic constructs, which are peculiar of translations. By privileging pseudo-translation over translation, the target literature author signals an interest in certain aspects of the source culture in its entirety, rather than in one single literary expression of it. So we could say that at the very moment in which a pseudo-translator writes text, he or she shapes the source text by gathering together all the elements of the source culture he or she aims to translate, to transfer into his own culture. The genre of pseudo-translation enjoys a long tradition, which includes many medieval texts, for example, Parsifal, 13th century, and also a number of texts from the 18th century, which was, in a way, the golden age of pseudo-translations. For example, Montesquieu's Lettres persanes, 1721, presented as a translation of the letters between two Persian noblemen, or also the famous poems of Macpherson, 1760, who claims to have translated Ossian, or also The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, 1765, which pretends to be a translation of a 16th century Italian manuscript. There are also examples from the 20th century and also from contemporary culture. One example is a novel by Karen Blixen from 1944, which came out as a work by Pierre Andrézel, translated into Danish by a Clara Svendsen that never existed. What interests me in this topic is the link between pseudo-translation and authorship, and differentiate between author, an individual subject, and authorship as a cultural artifact. By authorship, I mean the cultural performance of an author as an author, his posture littéraire. Posture littéraire is a concept by the Swiss literary scholar Jérôme Meizot, who defines posture as the singular way to occupy a position in the literary field. So posture constitutes the literary identity constructed by the author himself, and often relayed by the media, which give it to the public to read. So what interests me is the employment of pseudo-translation as an instrument used by authors in order to construct, to build their own literary identity. And today I would like to focus with you on a specific case study that is on the pseudo-translation written by one of the most significant poets of the Italian literature of the 20th century, who is Franco Fortini. Fortini was not only a poet, he was also a translator. He translated Brecht, Baudelaire, Éluard, Goethe, Krauss, Enzensberger, Milton, and many other European and non-European poets. And he was not only a poet and a translator, he was also a very important literary critic. He authored a vast essayistic oeuvre. We could say that the mutual influence between poetry, translation, and criticism is exactly the core feature of Fortini's literary activity. He strategically deploys in two opposite ways. On the one hand, Fortini combines poetry, translation, and criticism in order to shape for himself a clearly defined identity, which is the posture of an ethically committed and politically engaged intellectual. On the other hand, through the interweaving of poetry, of translation, and criticism, Fortini addresses the opposite urgency, the need of escaping the very same posture he fashioned himself with. While the creation of his own posture mostly takes place in his translations, the attempts to dismantle his constructed self are, in my opinion, rather to be found in his pseudo-translations. Fortini produced pseudo-translations throughout the 50 years of his literary activity, but these texts have never been investigated because scholars treated them as, let's say, a senseless divertissement. I would like to analyze Fortini's pseudo-translations from three perspectives. That is, as far as authorship, textuality, and reception are concerned. David Martens claimed that pseudo-translations are a rite of institution through which certain authors configure their authorial posture at crucial moments in their careers. I seek to show that, in this case, pseudo-translations are informed with an opposite intention. They are instrumental to the creation of a literary space, allowing the author to escape his posture in order to embody a multistable identity, consisting of several different and even contradictory authorial identities at the same time. In Fortini's pseudo-translations, authorship is enacted as a self-contradictory cultural performance. Secondly, I will focus on the level of textuality and show how Fortini's pseudo-translations discharge the concept of author tout court, or at least its established understanding. I will argue that these pseudo-translations foster an approach to literature along which the very same text can be equally, although alternatively, classified both as entirely original and entirely non-original, a paradox which challenges the conventional bound between the subject and the object of literary production. Finally, I will tackle the issue of the reader's reception of this form of text. Fortini's production encourages a perception of pseudo-translation as textual paradox, a text in which mutually exclusive features can be attributed to the same object. As a hermeneutic model for thinking through the issue of pseudo-translations reception, I propose to use multistable figures, the so-called Kippbilder. First part of my lecture, creating the posture translations. One of the most remarkable outputs of Fortini as a translator, as a poet, and as an editor, as a critic, is his work on Bertolt Brecht. The German writer had been a literary and political model for Fortini since the 40s. Later, Fortini translated with the essential support of his wife, Ruth Leiser, who was German mother tongue. Fortini translated some of Brecht's theatrical works. And in 1959, he managed to convince the publishing house Einaudi to publish an Italian anthology of Brecht's poem, Poesie e Canzoni, which features Fortini as an editor and also as a translator together with Ruth Leiser, and also as the author of the introductory critical essay. This anthology made Brecht in Italy immensely popular. Poesie e Canzoni can be regarded as the example par excellence of how Fortini uses his translations to create his own literary identity. The purpose of Poesie e Canzoni is not only to import Brecht's poems to Italy, but also to present Fortini as the Italian Brecht, that is, to reshape and showcase the figure of Brecht as the kind of intellectual Fortini himself wished to represent in Italy, a politically engaged and ethically committed poet. By means of acting as a translator and editor of Brecht, Fortini aims to become his Italian counterpart as a poet. On a more general level, re-embodying Brecht as an ethically and politically committed poet allows Fortini to create a posture which is intended as opposite, or at least alternative, to that of the leading contemporary Italian literates. Fortini pursues replacing both the model represented by the Nobel Prize-winning poet Eugenio Montale, who in Fortini's opinion is entrenched in a kind of individualistic and conservative ethics, and also the posture embodied by the neo-avanguardisti, for example, Edoardo Sanguinetti, which Fortini accuses of portraying social injustice for the elites instead of fighting it. Moreover, in his translation of Brecht, Fortini establishes a stylistic template that finds an echo in his own poems. The anthology Poesie e Canzoni features a lapidary and also epigrammatic syntax, as well as rhythmically irregular metrics full of interruptions and enjambements. This broken rhythm compels the reader to constantly deal with a gap between content and form. The semantic units almost never coincide with the metrical units, which is the verses. Rhymes are very rare. One example is a coloro che verranno, which is the translation of Brecht's An die Nachgeboren. And I don't have the English translation of this text, but what I want you to focus on is the metric. So I'll just read a couple of lines for you to hear the musicality or non-musicality of those verses. An die Nachgeborenen. Wirklich, ich lebe in finsteren Zeiten. Das arglose Wort ist töricht. Eine glatte Stirn deutet auf Unempfindlichkeit hin. Der Lachende hat die furchtbare Nachricht nur noch nicht empfangen. Fortini translates a coloro che verranno. Davvero vivo in tempi bui. La parola innocente è stolta. Una fronte distesa vuol dire insensibilità. Chi ride, la notizia atroce non l'ha ancora saputa. So this metrical characteristic became also the most evident marks of Fortini's own poetry. As an example, we might read Lo straniero benevolo, 1963. Lo straniero benevolo. Il sole arancione si posa sui fiori di un piccolo giardino della mia patria. Qualcuno abbrustolisce qualcosa al piano terra. È una sera di sabato. Forse non ci saranno più guerre. As in the translations of Brecht, Fortini's poem features no rhymes, irregular metrics, and broken verses, epigrammatic syntax, and many enjambements. As in Brecht's poems, proposition and verses never coincide. So it's no chance that after the publication of Poesie e Canzoni, Fortini and Brecht became in Italy inextricably associated figures. Giovanni Raboni spoke of the presence of a Brecht-Fortini line in the Italian literature of the 20th century. Fortini tends to Brechtianize not only his own poems, but also the texts of the authors he translates. This is especially evident in his self-anthology of translations Il ladro di ciliegie. An author Fortini Brechtianizes while translating him is Heinrich Heine. Heine's poetry is mostly characterized by a raffinate musicality, by regular metrics, and it's worth also to remind that the Italian translations of Heine, which are previous to the one Fortini made, had strongly emphasized the regular rhythm of Heine's poetry. For example, this on the left side is the first translation of Heine into Italian. Perché son mai sì pallide le rose, o mio tesor? Perché le azzurre mammole non parlan più d'amor? And this is on the left, on the right side, you find the most famous Italian translation of Heine before Fortini's translations, which is a translation by Giosuè Carducci, who translates Mit schwarzen Segel segelt mein Schiff. And this is the translation by Carducci. Passa la nave mia con vele nere pel selvaggio mare. Ho in petto una ferita di dolore, tu ti diverti a farla sanguinare. No? So you can see the rhymes and the musicality is maintained and exalted. Now let's take a look at Fortini's translation of the same poet of Heinrich Heine. Fortini translates Wenn ich an deinem Hause from Buch der Lieder 1827. I'll just read the first two strophes of the original text and of the translation. Heinrich Heine, wenn ich an deinem Hause. Wenn ich an deinem Hause des Morgens vorübergehe, so freut's mich, du lieber Kleine, wenn ich dich am Fenster sehe. Mit deinen schwarzbraunen Augen siehst du mich forschend an. Wer bist du und was fehlt dir, du fremder, kranker Mann? Franco Fortini translates Come sono contento. Come sono contento, mia piccola cara, se alla finestra ti vedo quando passo di mattina sotto casa tua. Quei tuoi occhi bruni, quasi neri, mi guardano e chiedono: chi sei? Che vai cercando, tu, uomo straniero, ferito? So Fortini applies to Heine's Lied an irregular metric scheme with strong enjambement, with interruption within the verses, with syncopated rhythms and no rhymes. This is evident right from the beginning. Wenn ich an deinem Hause des Morgens vorübergehe becomes Come sono contento, mia piccola cara, se alla finestra. While translating, Fortini makes sure that the verses almost never coincide with the semantic units. The regular rhythm of Heine's Lied becomes a sequence of fragments, which are anything but cantabile. Heine becomes, malgré soi, a member of the Brecht-Fortini line. So let's come to the second part of my talk, escaping the posterior pseudo-translations, authorship. However, Fortini's self-fashioning as an intellectual à la Brecht is a golden cage he needs to escape from. In one essay from 1966, Fortini expresses the strong need to disguise himself the same way actors do. He even confesses of being annoyed at his own authorial identity and reveals the desire to publish his own poems, and I quote, under another name, to enjoy once again the advantages of a double identity without giving up those of having one only. Or also under my name, but then with the aim of being outsized, free, unleashed from that little amount of stiffness, stone deadness, and fixity that can purse your lips while facing the body of life. So my claim is that Fortini's pseudo-translations are unequivocally an answer to this urge. In pseudo-translations, Fortini combines poetry, translation, and criticism, just like he did with Brecht, but with the opposite intention. Just a second. The opposite intention, the creation of a space where he can prescind from the normativity of his own posture. As I will try to show, these pseudo-translations are instrumental to placing his constructed self at a distance, for instance, by practicing poetics or aesthetics that are opposite to his own or that he even claims to despise. An example is Illuso da quest'orbita, an original text by Fortini, which Fortini presents as a translation from Rimbaud. The title, Illuso da quest'orbita, is a translation of a title by Rimbaud, which is Jouet de cet œil, but the poem is original. And funny enough, Fortini's fictitious Rimbaud speaks with the words of Eugenio Montale, an author Fortini openly criticizes, I mentioned before. So Fortini uses the pseudo-translation of Rimbaud as a way to disguise as an author who behaves oppositely to the way his Brechtian literary identity does. As regards to authorship, in pseudo-translation, Fortini's consistent posture is turned into a self-contradictory cultural performance. Fortini also employs pseudo-translations as a gesture of what I would like to call public ventriloquism, as a way of openly distancing himself from his own literary milieu. I will make an example. After the end of the Second World War, the Italian literature scene was strongly influenced by the journal Il Politecnico, founded by the Marxist intellectual Elio Vittorini. Fortini was one of the 4 editors of the journal, and Il Politecnico mostly published either texts and translations of ideologically aligned authors, for example, Pasternak or Gorky, or also authorless poems, such as the one on Lenin dictated by an unknown illiterate Armenian craftsman. The journal's graphic layout combined elements of Soviet futurism and also American picture stories in order to reach out to both the literary elites and also to a larger uneducated public. Several issues contained reportage about faraway cultures, for example, Egypt or Indonesia. Literature was a way of bringing the reader closer to the cultural life of foreign countries. All in all, Vittorini manifestly made an instrumental and political use of literature. Poems, as he wrote himself, must be useful in order to search for truth, per cercare la verità. So in November 1945, Vittorini asked Fortini to find some Italian translation of Chinese poetry for an issue of Politecnico on China. Fortini sent him a short poem by Xiao Xian, Via dello Yan'an. Vittorini enthusiastically published it, along with the caption, which was also provided by Fortini. Xiao Xian is one of the 50 founders of the League of Leftist Writers established in Shanghai in 1930. But Xiao Xian is no one else than Franco Fortini, who tricked Vittorini into thinking that his own original text was a translation from the Chinese. By deceiving Vittorini, Fortini aimed to demonstrate that literature can fully serve ideology or even usefulness and truth only at the price of becoming fake. Fortini's Via dello Yan'an can be regarded as a multiple pseudo-translation. In the original edition of the Politecnico issue, right next to the Xiao Xian poems, there is an article signed by Franco Fortini. It is entitled Poesia e Libertà, Poetry is Freedom, and this article provides a crucial key to interpret the pseudo-translation from the Chinese. In Poesia e Libertà, Fortini strongly asserts that literature owns an intrinsic aesthetic and hermeneutic value, aside from its usefulness and also from the alleged truths it conveys. Poetry, claims Fortini, is a way of presenting words, of approaching and echoing them, so that it is no longer required to know if what they say is true. Such an understanding of pseudo-translations is also embedded in the label Fortini chooses for this category of text. Fortini calls pseudo-translations traduzioni immaginarie, imaginary translations. Immaginarie is, of course, a synonym of fictitious. No? So the imaginary invalid is the one who claims to be something that he is not. So in this respect, the label traduzioni immaginarie fits in with the definition of pseudo-translation, which stresses the element of deception. For example, Popovich's fictitious translations or Yahlom literary forgeries. But The label Traduzioni Immaginarie places also particular emphasis on the positive role of fictitiousness and forgery. If rendered in terms of imagination, fictitiousness and forgery come to be associated with creativity and inventiveness. In other words, Fortini's Traduzioni Immaginarie are not only to be regarded as counterfeits, that is, as objects that are not what they seem, they are also objects that are what they seem, although only in the imagination. In the space of imagination, traduzioni immaginarie do have a non-fictitious ontological status. From this point of view, Fortini's understanding matches Emily Apter's definition of pseudo-translation as literature hors de ce monde, no? So literature out of this world. The space of imagination is connoted across culture as a space of freedom, and that is exactly what Fortini is longing for in the first place with his pseudo-translations. He's seeking a space free enough to allow him the exposure of his own contradictions. Fortini's Via dello Yanan also prompts some considerations as regards to authorship and its reception. From the point of view of the readers, who is the author of the poem? Fortini speaks also in the first person, both singular and plural, no? I miei colleghi, my colleagues, la nostra strada, our road, or noi torneremo, we will come back. The readers of Politecnico necessarily associated the personal pronouns and adjectives to Xiao Xian, not as a fictional narrator, but as a real person and as a testimony. As I already mentioned, the context of Politecnico associates literature and truth. However, to whom do the I and the we refer for later readers who are aware of the fact that this is a pseudo-translation and not a translation? In this case, who performs the speech act? Not merely Xiao Xian, who needed Franco Fortini to get his text published on Il Politecnico, and not merely Fortini, who acts and speaks as Xiao Xian, not as Franco Fortini. Both Fortini and Xiao Xian are implied by the very same word miei. The speech act is performed by two inextricably linked entities. Nevertheless, it is impossible to perceive the two voices simultaneously. The presence of the one implicates the absence of the other, because each of them confers to the text a radical different meaning. If we read the poem as authored by Xiao Xian, the text is exactly the one Vittorini was crying out for, a specimen of Marxist literary production. If we read the poem as authored by Franco Fortini, the very same text is in its entirety to be read as a bitter satire on Vittorini's cultural program, and therefore as a poetic statement which manages to drastically question and open up the cultural context it is embedded in. Both readings are equally possible, yet it is impossible to perform both simultaneously because of their radically opposite outcomes. After the irreversible experience of recognizing the possibility of both interpretations, the reader's attention is compelled to permanently go back and forth between them. Similarly, after recognizing the presence of the author as both fictitious and real entity, the reader's attention permanently oscillates between taking into account the former or the latter. In this respect, I would argue that the reception of this text is informed by a multistable identity and multistable authorship. Just a second. So, escaping the posterior, pseudo-translations, the second perspective, textuality. With his Traduzioni Immaginarie, Fortini deliberately expands the common understanding of pseudo-translation. In his Lezioni sulla traduzione, which is a posthumously published collection of essays on translation, Fortini gathers under the label Traduzioni Immaginarie a group of texts resulting from very diverse hypertextual processes, for example, forgery, imitation, translation, rewriting, allusion, as well as also original writing. In the following minutes, I will attempt to classify the different kinds of traduzioni immaginarie by differentiating between 4 typologies. A, implicit pseudo-translations, so original texts which are presented as translations without mentioning that the source text doesn't exist. B, explicit pseudo-translations, which are openly presented as pseudo-translations, so translations which readers are aware have no original. C, fakes, translation which counterfeit the target language. And D, original texts alluding to other original texts. Implicit pseudo-translations, so original texts which are presented as translations, that is, poems modeled on translational structures, although no source exists for them. No? So we already saw Illuso da quest'orbita, we saw Via dello Yenan. A further examples are the poems Varsavia 1939 and Varsavia 1944. When Fortini was in Zurich in 1944, he wrote 2 pseudo-translations from the Polish without having ever read a single line of Polish literature, not even in translation, as he himself claims. He had in mind only a peculiar rhythmic structure, a sequence of unrhymed quatrains of regular verses, which in Italian, in his opinion, are perceived as signals of translation from Slavic language. I shall read the first quatrain, Varsavia 1944, e dopo verranno da te ancora una volta a contarti, a insegnarti, a mentirti, e dopo verranno uomini senza cuore a urlare forte libertà e giustizia. And so on. Indeed, it's an unrhymed quatrains of regular verses. Why is Fortini incorporating in a text of his own features which characterize translations from a foreign culture? We have to keep in mind that in 1944, Italy was still a fascist country, and that Fortini had escaped Italy to take refuge in Switzerland, where he joined the resistance. Therefore, we can read the pseudo-Polish form of this poem as an attempt by Fortini to distance himself from the Italian culture and I hope you hear me. I heard something. Okay. To distance himself from Italian culture and self-fashion himself as a stranger to his own nation. The publishing history of this poem is also interesting. Presenting them as translations, Fortini sent Varsavia 1939 and Varsavia 1944 to a weekly journal for Italian emigrants in Switzerland. The poems were published unsigned in 1944. A few months after the publication, a Polish poet, Stanisław Baliński, who believed they were Italian original texts, translated them into his own language, so into Polish. The 2 Polish versions were printed in several journals for Polish immigrants in London, in Buenos Aires, in New York, and a few years later, the Polish translation were republished by Baliński as his own original texts, whereas Fortini included the Italian poems in his own anthology, Foglio di Via, from 1946. B, explicit pseudo-translations, openly presented as such. An example is Traduzione immaginaria da Mallarmé. In this case, the missing deception of the reader aligns the pseudo-translation process to that of imitation, but these texts are not only imitations, because the cultural nostalgia they imply is expressed through specifically translational patterns. Traduzione immaginaria da Mallarmé features translational characteristics, such as linguistic calques from the French, and also the rhythmic structure of novenario, a verse which is very rare in the Italian poetry and is used merely as a translation of the French octosyllab. Third typology, fakes, or translations which counterfeit the target language. The sonnet Al pensiero della morte e dell'inferno is a translation of Góngorà's sonnet alla memoria della muerte e dell'infierno, 1612. Fortini's translation makes use of a reconstructed and therefore fictitious 16th century Italian language, thereby producing a linguistic forgery, a fake Cinquecento. The translation was produced around 1930, a period in which the Italian poeti ermetici re-evaluated the so-called metaphysical poetry to which they also ascribed Góngora. So it is noteworthy that Fortini openly criticized poeti ermetici throughout his life. The translation, Fortini's translation, was not published until 1983, when Fortini decided to accept, and I quote, the quantum of falsehood embedded in such an operation. Fortini translates as if he were an Italian poet of the 16th century, for example, Torquato Tasso, which he explicitly mentions. It's interesting to notice that in 1983, Fortini's text was published on the left side of the page, while the Spanish one, the one by Góngora, on the right. So probably in order to underline that Góngorà's text is not the real source of Fortini's fake Cinquecento. Fortini was not aware, however, that, funnily enough, his Italian fake Cinquecento already existed, namely as an original text. As a matter of fact, Góngorà's sonnet is nothing but a translation from the Italian, namely of Angelo Grillo's sonnet Tra le tombe dei morti orrende e scure, written around 1596. D. Last typology, original poetic compositions. Fortini also classifies many of his original poems as traduzioni immaginarie. He particularly mentions texts with manifest intertextual allusions, such as, for example, Traducendo Brecht or Traducendo Milton. Despite the title, these are among his most original compositions. Nonetheless, Fortini claims that they are traduzioni immaginarie, as if they may be regarded as translations of Milton's or Brecht's lost texts. The gerund of the verb translate, traducendo, in the title of an original poem emphasizes that poetry and translation are, for this text, equally valid categories. By expanding the category of traduzione immaginaria to the point of also including in it original texts, Fortini breaks the bionic correspondence between the subject and the object of literary production, thereby distancing himself from the status of author tout court. Within the space of traduzioni immaginarie, texts are both original and non-original. They are both written and not written by the author. Texts such as Via dello Ienan or Varsavia 1944 are fully entitled to count both as derivative and original. Traduzione immaginaria allows the categories of original and non-original to apply to the very same text, even though they remain incompatible, a paradox fostering an understanding of textuality as potentially released from the concept of author. Traduzioni immaginarie enable the coexistence of original and non-original textuality. On the other hand, originality and non-originality remain mutually exclusive categories, impossible to be perceived at once because of their radical different outcomes. As a translation, Al pensiero della morte e dell'inferno is an attempt to remake the sonnet Góngora would have written if Góngora had lived in Italy in the 16th century. But as an original text, this is Fortini's long-time hidden attempt to conform his poetry to the metaphysical trends of the 30s. As far as the reception is concerned, readers oscillate between perceiving the original aura of a derivative text and the derivative character of an original text. Both are alternately present and absent. In this respect, in the case of traduzioni immaginarie, we may speak of a multistable textuality. The last part of my lecture, which is also the shortest part, it's kind of conclusion, Escaping the posterior pseudo-translations reception. As regards to their reception, Fortini's traduzioni immaginarie seem to foster an understanding of pseudo-translation as a textual paradox. My claim is that pseudo-translation may be regarded, concerning its reception, as a textual paradox in which opposite elements, despite remaining mutually exclusive, are allowed to coexist within the same space, both on level of reception of the subject and of the object of literary production. First point, subject. By wearing someone else's mask or exposing the process of distancing himself from his constructed self, Fortini establishes in his Traduzioni Immaginarie a paradoxical relationship between different speech acts, both relating to the same speaker. As regards to authorship, readers' attention oscillates between two alternative poles, the author being a real and a fictitious entity, embodying a subject as constituted and as constituting. This Munchausen effect, we may call it like this, triggered by the self-referential character of Traduzioni Immaginarie, brings into question the traditional concept of author. Second point, the object. Traduzioni immaginarie dissolve and simultaneously exalt the opposition between the concept of original and non-original. The self-referential character of traduzioni immaginarie enables them to ascribe the same text to mutually exclusive categories, original and derivative. The readers oscillate between perceiving a translation which has no original and perceiving an original which is linked to an evoked text which is unattainable. Both interpretations are alternately present and absent. A useful hermeneutic model for thinking through the issue of the reception of pseudo-translations may be found, in my opinion, in multistable figures, or as Douglas Hofstadter calls them, ambigrams. This is a particular subtypology of ambigrams, actually, multistable figures. In multistable figures, such as the famous duck rabbits mentioned by Wittgenstein and later by Thomas Kuhn, the same image allows for different and equally valid descriptions. Similarly, in pseudo-translation, the same text allows for different and equally valid interpretations. The multistable image can be interpreted both as a duck and as a rabbit. The text can be interpreted both as original and non-original. Categories that appear to be mutually exclusive turn out to be attributed to the same object. On the other hand, the multistable figure can be interpreted either as a duck or as a rabbit, but not as both of them at the same time. Similarly, when readers are confronted with pseudo-translations, after recognizing the coexistence of opposite features, real and fictitious author, original and non-original text, they are compelled to continuously go back and forth between them, remaining trapped in a multistable perception of the object. Thus, as Christoph Holzhey stated, multistable figures may offer a helpful model to think through the possibility of having incommensurable alternatives without promoting a radical constructivism, subjectivism, or relativism. They problematize fixed dichotomies between subject and object, reality and construction, epistemology and ontology, and natural and conventional categories. But rather than reducing, conflating, or bridging them, they can also make their discontinuities and ruptures both palpable and intelligible. Thank you so much for your attention.